Howdy howdy, Sue Devil here. We're going to continue our look into melee combat. More specifically, we're going to see if we can calculate an absolute value of one unit with respect to another, and we're also going to take a deeper look into the melee animations to see how much they affect the outcome of a battle. This is a spreadsheet that someone kindly posted online with all the units and an easy way to compare them to one another. I'm not sure who to attribute this spreadsheet to, but if I find out, I'll definitely post it. I will post a link to where I found it, so if anybody else wants to get it and do their own research, they certainly can. I added a tab to start figuring out a way to calculate the value of units relative to each other. Basically, the way this chart works is here are all the units that I'm comparing. This is the defending unit, and this is the unit I'm comparing it against. Basically took the melee attack, melee defense, and I calculated a hit ratio from this unit to this unit here, and their hit ratio compared to you, the damage per hit they do, the damage per hit they do to you, how many swings it's going to take them to kill you, and vice versa, and got a damage ratio. I also put in there a cost ratio of their purchase cost versus each other, and combine these two to get a rough value ratio. So in this example, I'm looking at other dwarf infantry units compared to miners to see how much extra value they actually have. We know that, for example, a dwarf warrior costs more. Their cost ratio is 1.36, but their value ratio here is 1.14. So they do a lot more damage. So you do add value over a miner in this case if you get a dwarf warrior. If we go down the list, we start to see some units pop out, like longbeards, which tend to be a very, very good dwarven unit. You can see their value ratio is 2.17. Even though their damage ratio is 4.02, their cost ratio is 1.06. I calculated their value ratio at 2.17. So what I did is I wanted to test kind of how that value ratio actually operates in game. So I'll show you a little bit of the testing I did to start to verify that this is a reasonable way to compare units. So if you look at this number, apparently a longbeard is worth about 2.17 units of miners, and we'll go take a look at that. For the first test, I basically blobbed up my 2 units of miners into one small group so that they could fight the longbeards face to face, and that all 3 units would lose vigor at the same time. If you saw my last video, and you'll see something in this video, vigor plays a very important role, and I just wanted to take that part out of it. So I ran 5 tests like this. Then I grabbed my miners and I ran them into the longbeards one at a time. Waited till the first unit routed, then ran in a second one to see how a fresh unit of miners would do against an exhausted unit of longbeards. For the last test, I ran the miners in such a way so that one would engage the longbeards from the front and one from the rear. We know there's penalties to being attacked in the rear or on the sides. I think it's 65% reduction in melee defense to the rear, maybe 35% to the sides. Not 100% sure on that, but I wanted to really see the effect of doing it this way because logically, you would think that the advantage of having a lot of units as opposed to your opponents is that you can run extra units around the back to make this happen. So I really wanted to see what was the advantage of doing it this way compared to any other way. What those tests produced is this data. Basically the first test where we ran 2 at a time, we look at the kill ratio generated was about 2.6 to 1. And the miners didn't win any of the combats. Now we know the longbeards are at about a 2.17 to 1 value ratio, so we would expect the longbeards to win that encounter, and they did it fairly convincingly on average. They only had 1 battle where it was really, really close. Then when we come over here and we started sending in the units one at a time, we got something interesting. You know, if we look back here at our longbeards, the kill ratio should be about 4 to 1 according to the calculation, and when we sent that first unit in, the kill ratio averaged 3.7 to 1. Now they're going to rout, they're not going to all fight to the death, so that confirms that our calculation seems reasonably accurate. Then when we get to the second set of miners that went in to the Longbeards that were exhausted, the kill ratio went way down, and you can really see they basically lost 51% of their combat effectiveness against that second unit of miners. What's really interesting is the total kill ratio was 2.5 to 1. You compare that to the sending in 2 at a time, where we don't get to take advantage of that exhaustion effect. It's only 2.6 to 1, and the deaths and kills all seem pretty close, and in neither case did any of the miners win the battle. There's some reasons for that, which I'll get into when we get into the animations. The last test is when we sent them in 2 versus 1. One set of miners in the front and one in the back. And here we noticed a very significant improvement in the performance of the miners versus the Longbeards. The miners actually won some of the battles, and the overall kill ratio was only 1.9 to 1. So when you're looking at how you deploy our units and what to expect, first of all, I would expect that rather than sending them in 2 at a time, if I let one fight until the other unit was exhausted and then sent in the second unit, I would get a much better performance. But that doesn't seem to be the case, and we'll go over why I think that is. But if you have a 2v1 and you have one attacking in the back, it does make a very significant difference in the combat performance. We'll get to the animation part shortly, but first I want to go through the testing that I did and how I got to the discoveries I made. The next thing I wanted to test is our units against Black Orcs. In multiplayer or online battles, we know Black Orcs are a very good unit, and they do tend to punch above their weight, and there's some very good reasons why they do that. But I wanted to see how dwarf units compared, and if we look at this, we have really 2 units that, when we look at their kill ratio in the calculation, should beat Black Orcs pretty handily, and those are Hammers and Ironbreakers. So I wanted to test the Hammers and see how good they did. A lot of people say Hammers are the best dwarven unit and one of the best melee units in the game, and looking at their value ratio, even though they're very expensive, it's 1.69, so it seems to be very high. And further on down, I've done a rough DPS per 1,000 gold calculation, and they're at 167, which is the highest dwarven unit in this case, especially when you compare it to something like an Ironbreaker that's only 72 DPS per 1,000 gold. Now this calculation is a representation, it's not exact, it's just a way to compare the units. And just something worth noting, Slayers, they are just unfortunately a very poor unit in every single situation, with the exception of against large units like trolls and whatnot, but they tend to be very poor. Their value ratio is only 0.48. Their DPS per 1,000 gold, even if you're attacking units that don't have a lot of armor, this doesn't ever reach the heights that the other units do. But anyways, we'll go take a look at the testing we did with our Hammers and see, do they beat the Black Orc units like we think they should. As before, I just ran a very simple set of tests. We did 5 battles with Hammers versus Black Orcs, and here are the results. As expected, our Hammers won all the battles, and relatively convincing fashion. Even though the kill ratio was only 1.3 to 1, the combat is not quite perfect because the Black Orcs have 80 units and the Hammers have 100. So while the Black Orcs usually ended up with about 5 units left, the Hammers did end up with 41, 42, kind of in that range. So this confirms that, again, our calculation is reasonably close. If we look at what we would expect the kill ratio to be, would be 1.41, and what we got was 1.3. So again, not perfect, but at least that's giving us some confirmation that our calculation is reasonable. I continued on the testing with Ironbreakers versus Black Orcs, and the Ironbreakers actually have a higher value ratio than the Hammers, so I expected them to win the battles even more handily. But this is where the problems started to come in, and the data did not match the calculation. I'll show you what we got as a result. And just so you know, I took the Ironbreakers' ability to throw their blasting charges off and just put them in melee because I wanted a straight up melee fight to match the calculation. The results we got here are pretty surprising, to be honest. The combat between the two units came out to be about even, with 2 wins for the Ironbreakers and 3 wins for the Black Orcs, but based on the calculation it should be a complete wipeout, although it should take a lot longer based on the melee defense of the Ironbreakers and the low melee attack and damage. You would expect them to mop the floor with the Black Orcs, but that just isn't the case. We see here that the kill ratio was 0.9. If we go back and look at the spreadsheet, the Ironbreakers should have a kill ratio of 1.62, but it's not even close. So what's happening there? How could this be? I really first went and thought maybe it's the combat animations. Maybe Ironbreakers have a slower combat animation like some of the other units in game, so I went and measured, and I think someone had done some really good research on the combat animation, and I think it's supposed to be around 3.83 seconds per animation, and when I measured it I got between 3.5 to 4 seconds per unit, both Black Orcs and Ironbreakers. So that's not it. So what exactly is going on here was my thought. So a top tier dwarf unit being mopped up, well, not mopped up, but handled by these Black Orcs has to be resolved. And I really queued this up and started looking at the animations, trying to understand how things were functioning. And even though the dwarfs only have about a 10% chance to be hit by the Black Orcs, you'll see them hit over and over and over and over again. So basically, I think the melee calculation happens separately as to whether the units actually hit each other. So you'll see one unit hit another and will stagger them or cause them to move, or you'll see a little blood spatter. That doesn't necessarily mean they've done any damage. One unit hitting another simply puts it into its stagger animation. And this is where we start to see why this actually happens, why Ironbreakers can lose to the Black Orcs in this case. It's because just like in life, in Warhammer, the size of your weapon matters, and the amount of mass to your body makes a difference. And you can see when the Black Orcs stagger the Ironbreakers, they put them through a pretty big animation and send the Ironbreakers back away. They have to recover and get back into the fight. But the same doesn't happen in reverse. The Ironbreakers need to be a lot closer to go through their attack animation, so they have to recover and then move forward and then get to the Black Orcs. And often the Black Orcs can take 2, 3, sometimes even 4 swings without getting one in return from the Ironbreaker, because they've just continually staggered them, even though they're not necessarily doing any damage. And that's where the real difference comes in. Now, I did continue testing other dwarf melee units, particularly the Dwarf Warrior and the Longbeards, and they all share this animation flaw, which is a little bit disappointing because you think when you would get into the higher tier units, they'd be a little bit more robust or be able to take a hit a little better and not go through that big stagger animation, but they all share that same flaw. And when I went back and looked a lot closer at the combat when I had the big blob of 2 units of miners versus the Longbeards, a similar thing was happening, which is why they seem to outperform versus the one at a time scenario, in that there was a much denser grouping of miners, and even though they were still hitting at the rate they were supposed to, they were often a little bit of a 2v1 where the miners would stagger the Longbeards would come back, and the next miner would stagger him again. So they got to really improve their performance in that way. So I think that's an important bit of information. So what can we take out of this information? Basically, and I'll continue to develop my value ratio so I can understand one unit versus another, but a few of the key points you can understand is that in combat, units that have two-handed weapons or bigger weapons and are heavier and go through a smaller stagger animation do up their value somewhat, as opposed to a one-handed unit that is light or small or short. Now, There are other little bits that are important too, like units with high melee attack versus low melee defense are going to tend to perform a little bit better or punch above their weight. Units due to the exhaustion effect, same with high armor units, they are also going to suffer a little bit more because they're going to lose some of that effectiveness of their armor. But I'm going to continue developing this value calculation to see if I can hone it in a little bit more, and of course do some more testing and see if I can get better information on that side. And of course I'll continue making videos and show you guys the results of my testing, because ultimately I really want to try and make the perfect dwarf army. I'm very much a dwarf fanboy, and I absolutely love the artwork and lore in Warhammer. I think they've got it right on the money. So I'm not interested in making, perfect chaos armies or anything else. I'm interested in making a good dwarf army. And I know in multiplayer, the dwarfs do underperform, and they're probably I would imagine, the lowest rated faction. I don't know if there's anyone who's going to perform worse than them right now because of that. They all have good armor and high melee defense, and it really does. And they're short and stubby, stubby little dwarf arms, and it really does impact how they're going to perform in combat. So I'll continue my testing, and hopefully I'll get a little more information, and I'll share it with everyone. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.